You booked the trip for adventure, but what happens when you realize you're completely alone and someone else knows it? Tonight, we venture into the archives of Reddit's most chilling true stories. These are not campfire tales. They are first-person accounts from the forums r/LetsNotMeet and r/CreepyEncounters, stories submitted by travelers who sought solitude, only to find they were not the only ones paying attention. This is a journey into the moment a solo trip turns into a fight for safety, the moment the world gets very, very quiet, and the wrong person starts to listen. Our first story begins on a remote highway in the American Southwest. A young woman we'll call Sarah was on a solo cross-country road trip, chasing the freedom of the open road. Her world was the rental car, her playlist, and the endless stretch of asphalt under a vast desert sky. The central conflict was simple: distance. She was hours from the next major town. Her phone service was a flickering bar, and the only signs of life were the occasional truck roaring past in the opposite lane. She felt the exhilarating isolation of true independence. That is until she noticed the van. A plain, white panel van that had been in her rearview mirror for nearly an hour, matching her speed exactly, never passing, never falling back. At first, she dismissed it. A coincidence, another long-haul driver. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in violent oranges and purples, a knot of unease tightened in her stomach. The turning point came when she took an exit for a lonely gas station, a single fluorescent beacon in the gathering dusk. The van followed, and it didn't pull up to a pump. It parked at the far edge of the lot, facing her, its headlights off, its driver invisible behind the glare of the station's lights on its windshield. She was locked in. Her sanctuary of solitude had just become a very visible trap. Act 2. Inside the station, Sarah's hands shook as she paid for her fuel and a bottle of water. She made brief, panicked eye contact with the elderly cashier, but said nothing. The rules of polite society, the fear of seeming paranoid, held her tongue. Back in her car, she fumbled with her keys, her every movement feeling exposed under the gaze of that silent van. She decided on a test. Instead of returning to the highway, she turned onto a smaller access road, one that led to a closed-down scenic overlook. Her heart hammered against her ribs. In her mirror, the van's headlights flared to life. It pulled out of the lot and smoothly turned onto the same road. This was no coincidence. The confrontation was now undeniable. She sped up, the tires kicking up gravel. The van matched her pace. She took a sudden, sharp turn onto an even narrower dirt track, a road not meant for her small sedan. The van followed without hesitation. The complication deepened. This wasn't a random predator of opportunity. He was committed. He was hunting. The landscape grew darker, more desolate. Her phone was now a useless brick. The highest point of tension crashed over her when her car, hitting a deep pothole, suffered a catastrophic blowout. The vehicle lurched into a shallow ditch. As she sat there, stunned by the impact, she saw the van's headlights slow to a stop about 50 yards behind her. The driver's door opened. A tall, silhouetted figure stepped out into the beam of his own headlights, and he began to walk, slowly and deliberately, toward her disabled car. Act 3. Sarah's mind screamed. Her doors were locked, but she was a sitting duck. The figure was halfway to her car when a miracle, in the form of a massive logging truck, appeared on the main road behind the van. Its air horn blared, a shocking roar in the silent desert. The figure stopped, turned, and looked at the approaching giant. In that moment of distraction, Sarah's survival instinct overrode her panic. She shoved her door open, scrambled out into the cold desert night, and ran, not away from the road, but perpendicular into the pitch-black scrubland. She heard a curse behind her, but she didn't look back. She ran until her lungs burned, then crouched behind a cluster of rocks, trembling. She watched as the figure returned to his van. He sat there for what felt like an eternity, his engine running. Then finally, he turned the van around and drove away. Sarah waited in the freezing dark for over an hour before daring to creep back to the road. She was eventually found by a state trooper. The resolution was not a capture, nor an explanation. The van and its driver were never found. The conflict resolved only in her escape. The emotional peak is the lingering image. her alone in the vast, indifferent desert, realizing that true terror isn't in the darkness itself, but in the single point of light within it that is watching you. Our second story transports us to a charming, centuries-old hostel in Eastern Europe. A backpacker named Mark sought authentic experience, choosing a budget room in a building that was more history than hotel. The setup was atmospheric: creaking floorboards, thick stone walls, and a shared bathroom down a long, dimly lit hallway. His conflict began not with a person, but with a sound. On his first night, he was jolted awake at 3:17 a.m. by the distinct metallic scrape of his own door's deadbolt being slowly, carefully turned from the outside. He froze, breath held. The scraping stopped. He told himself it was the old building settling, another guest confused about their room. But the next night, it happened again. 3:17 a.m., the same precise scrape. This time, he saw the door handle depressed slightly. Someone was testing it. The turning point came on the third night. Prepared, Mark had wedged a chair under the handle. At 3:17 a.m., the scraping started again. But then it stopped, and he heard the softest sound of footsteps moving away, not down the hall toward the other rooms, but up the hallway, toward a storage attic the staff said was locked and unused. In Act 2, Mark's investigation escalated. He asked the daytime desk clerk about the attic, feigning historical curiosity. The clerk's friendly demeanor vanished. He stated flatly that the attic was not part of the hostel, had been sealed for years, and that Mark shouldn't worry about it. The dismissal felt too sharp, too final. That night, Mark decided to stay awake. He positioned himself by his door, peering through the tiny crack at the bottom. At 3:17 a.m., the footsteps arrived, not from the hall, but from above, a faint creak directly over his room. Then silence. The complication? The threat wasn't trying to break in from the hallway. It was already inside the building's skeleton. The tension built to its peak when Mark, using his phone's flashlight, examined his door the next morning. On the outside, around the keyhole, were fresh, fine scratches. Not from a key, from something being inserted to manipulate the lock. And on the dusty floor of the hallway beneath the attic door's threshold, he saw a single set of footprints, facing out. Someone stood there, listening to the hallway below. Act 3's climax was one of horrifying revelation. On his final night, Mark pretended to leave for a late train, telling the clerk he was checking out. Instead, he hid in an alcove near the shared bathroom, watching his own door. The hostel fell silent. At 3:17 a.m., he heard a faint click from above. A section of the hallway ceiling, a disguised panel near the attic door, silently lowered. A makeshift rope ladder unfurled, and a figure, clad in dark clothing, descended directly into the hallway. It was the night clerk, a man Mark had never seen before. The man didn't approach Mark's room. He simply stood in the center of the hall, staring at Mark's door with an unnerving intensity for a full minute. Then he turned and looked directly down the hall toward Mark's hiding place. He didn't move. He just stared into the darkness. Mark held his breath, his blood turning to ice. After an eternity, the man turned, climbed back up the ladder, and pulled the panel shut. Mark fled the hostel immediately. The conflict remains profoundly unresolved. He never reported it to the police there. The resolution is the haunting knowledge. The true horror wasn't a monster in the attic. It was the realization that the caretaker of the place you paid for safety was the architect of the threat, and his nightly ritual wasn't about breaking in. It was about maintaining a watch. The question of what he was watching for and what happened to those who didn't pretend to leave remains unanswered. Our final story is deceptively simple. A woman named Anya was on a solo hiking trip through a famous national forest. Her world was pine needles, trail markers, and her own steady breath. The conflict emerged subtly. She began to feel a persistent, nagging sense of being followed. No sounds, no glimpses, just a primal itch between her shoulder blades. She'd stop, listen. Nothing but forest sounds. She chalked it up to nerves. The turning point that locked her in was a photograph. Stopping to drink water, she used her phone to take a quick selfie with a beautiful waterfall in the background. It wasn't until that evening, back at her campsite, that she scrolled through the day's photos. In that selfie, over her shoulder, deep in the trees behind the waterfall's mist, was the faint but unmistakable silhouette of a man, standing perfectly still, watching her. Act 2's confrontation was a psychological siege. The next day, Anya was hyper-alert. She took random turns on intersecting trails. She doubled back. She saw nothing, yet the feeling was heavier, more oppressive. The complication arrived with the weather. A thick, sudden fog rolled into the mountain valleys, reducing visibility to mere feet. The forest became a ghostly, silent labyrinth. She knew she was close to a trailhead parking lot, but in the fog, every direction looked the same. She pulled out her phone for GPS. No signal. The tension built to its breaking point when she heard it. A soft, rhythmic sound cutting through the silent fog. Not footsteps. It was the sound of someone lightly striking a tree trunk with a stick. Tap, tap, tap. It came from her left. Then, a minute later, from her right. Tap, tap, tap. It was circling her, using sound to disorient her in the blinding fog. Act 3's resolution was one of sheer, desperate instinct. Anya knew running blindly could send her over a cliff or deeper into the wilderness. The tapping was getting closer, more frequent. She had one advantage, her whistle, a safety item attached to her backpack. Instead of blowing it for help, who would hear? She did the opposite. She remained utterly silent. She crouched low behind a fallen log, becoming just another shape in the fog. She listened as the tapping came to where she had just been standing. It stopped. She heard the faint crunch of a boot on pine needles. Then a low, whispered voice, so close it made her skin crawl. It simply said, "I know you're here." She didn't move. She didn't breathe. Minutes passed like hours. Finally, she heard the footsteps move away, the tapping resuming, growing fainter, fading into the white void. She waited for what felt like an eternity before creeping in the opposite direction, eventually stumbling onto a road. The climax is the quiet horror of that whispered sentence. The conflict's resolution is her escape, but it offers no victory. The emotional peak is the understanding that in the vastness of nature, the most terrifying predator is not the one that attacks, but the one that has all the time in the world to wait for you to make the wrong move. 3 journeys, 3 moments where solitude curdled into vulnerability. These stories linger because they are not about ghosts or demons, but about the most unsettling monster of all, the human being who sees your aloneness not as a state of being, but as an invitation. You can check out of the hostel. You can leave the desert. You can escape the fog. That some doors, once you realize they were never really locked to begin with, can never be closed again.